So where is Finland? That always has to be Sweden. So next coming up is actually Magnus, who's I would say, the cardinal of digital government of Sweden, and to talk about how the ecosystem is being built up there. All right, and the video of Sweden.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Really impressed to hear the other presentations. Really exciting My Data initiative from Sweden. Really impressed by the basic data program in Denmark. And we've seen some great, I think, examples of how to use analytics to get policy going in this area. I will talk a bit more about how to create services out of data. And the perspective is, I guess, Sweden today. Sweden, as most of you know, is a mature welfare society. We pride ourselves of having a good welfare system, and we also have very good public administration in place to run this welfare state. And I guess we thought we were finished. We could just sit back and run that welfare state. Suddenly we had these migration issues coming in, the globalization, urbanization, and environmental crisis that cuts policy issues in totally different ways than the Swedish welfare state was set up. And that brings us to the realization that, we actually have to reinvent our state. So how can we do that? We also see a productivity decrease actually in the economy because industry is not using digital the way it should do. And if the productivity goes down, our welfare is threatened. So how can we use digital to boost both productivity in the economy and efficiency in the welfare sector? Einstein once said, the best brains always seems to work for someone else. And I think this is a good perspective to have in our heads when we think about reinventing the state. And the key, as we've seen in this conference, I think is data. If data stays locked in an organization, innovation stays locked into that organization. And you don't get access to the brains outside your organization. So one key is, of course, as we've been talked about this many times, open government and open data. I'll just give you my current favorite example of open data in Sweden now. It's called the Commuter Train Prognosis app. And it actually relies on sensors on the bogies, the wheels of the commuter trains, and actually transmits data 200,000 times a second to optimize the engines on the train so the train moves smoothly. Someone published that at open data. It's like, hey, somebody can use that. And somebody did. So actually, what that sensor does is to weigh the wagon. So you can actually, by an algorithm, calculate where you have less or more people in each wagon. So the app will actually show you where the highest probability of finding a seat will be on that station. I think that's extremely clever. And why didn't we think of that inside the public sector? Well, that's again because most of the innovation power sits in our companies. So how do we get hold of that? This is, I think, one of the key issues. Now, getting open government going, the focus has been on data out. How do we get data out? How do we get supply of data out? What we see today is something else going. We could call it the data revolution. We met the second in command in IBM, and he used this one-liner: data is king, cloud is the base, mobile is the driver. And I think that sort of sums up what happens outside the public sector. Because if you see the smartphone sales really surpassing the PC as the computer hub, you also see in the middle chart that the cost of producing, sharing, and storing data is actually plummeting. So what we see is an explosion of data outside the public sector. I think we've been used to, in the public sector, thinking of us as a big data producer. Public sector information, we're talking about open data, and also my data, of course. But that actually dwarfs when we see the revolution of big data, or smart data, whatever you want to call it. And then, for government to promote innovation in this sector, data in becomes just as important as data out, and also the aggregation and the synthesis of smart data and public sector information data. And that's, I think, one of the tricks that we want to work with. It's also important to see that even though this is a technical revolution in a sense, the impact will be on the social side. This enables social innovation, social and political innovation, to the extent that we probably haven't seen since the early 20th century. So how can we reap the benefits of this? Gartner calls this the transformation from open government to smart government, where government is just one piece of the puzzle in a bigger data environment. OECD calls this that we've reached a new level of maturity. We shouldn't talk about e-government anymore. We should talk about digital government. And this is all about working inside an ecosystem that is data-driven. I'll give you 3 good examples of what this means. This is a service called Propeller. Some of you might have asthma. What the service does is that you put on a small GPS locator on your inhaler and then share the data when you inhale to relieve your asthma symptoms, and you share that to the cloud to other people so they can see where you have experienced symptoms, and you get these hotspots. And then you have a service that goes bzzzt inside your pocket. Don't go there. I think it's a fantastic way of just showing how sharing data can have serious impact on public costs. Hospitals in areas where you see implementation of this has cut 25% of visits to the emergency unit, and patients have experienced 50% cut in acute symptoms like this. And this is just by this little notion of sharing data with each other. So this would be a good example of what we call open and data-driven innovation, where users, citizens, can share data with hospitals and each other, and you get an environment where you, as a user, can be smarter. Another, I think, very cool example is a Swedish startup called Safi. This is a female entrepreneur. She targets female insecurity in public spaces. Many times when we see public infrastructure, they're designed by men. Men thinks about public infrastructures and its transports and all these things, and no one really thinks about the experience of moving inside the public space like women do. Now, what the app does is basically that you have a button called Track Me and a list of friends. That means if you push that button, your friend will track you on Google Maps. So they will make sure that you will come home safely. Now, if something happens during your walk through the park or in that tunnel, she developed a hardware button that you can press, and that means that all the other safety apps within 500 meters goes off into alarm mode. So we as citizens can come and assist you if you're in trouble. The third level of data-driven innovation in there is that when she has critical mass of data, she can share that with the public sector to see this is where women feel unsecure. Now, when she approached the Swedish public sector, she got a very negative response, and actually the quote was, "Why is this important? This is just for women, isn't it?" So she instead broke the Swedish record in crowdfunding. But the interesting part that it wasn't Swedes that invested in this, it was the Asians. Just imagine the market for this service is India, or in China, or in Africa. So she doesn't care about Sweden anymore. She goes instantly global. So I think that's a good example of data-driven innovation. Here's another small company, startup called Findity. And you might ask yourself, well, what does receipts have to do with public sector innovation? Well, one implementation of this is product recalls. So suddenly if you have a child chair being defunct of some kind, you immediately get an SMS that, whoops, don't use that. Go back to the store with that. Or if you find a bad meat or bad fish that you shouldn't eat, you get an SMS that say, don't eat that, return it to the store instead. And if you consider the implications of actually having full transparency in any value chain in commerce, in this case it's the food chain, and these guys actually hook up with GS1, which is the holders of the barcodes, and they sit on this enormous standardized framework that tracks products all through down to the production. So you can basically see what fishing boat was fishing that fish that you're eating. Now that's one thing, but if you apply this to other social problems, and I'll give you a number here. If you invest $1,000 in heroin trade, you'll gain $20,000. So that's kind of a good deal. If you invest $1,000 in counterfeit drugs, ordinary medicines that you fake, the return is $200,000 on those invested $1,000. So the market for counterfeit drugs, in Africa you have an average of 50% fake malaria drugs out. This is something that we need to address. Now, building these kinds of transparency apps and value and transparent value change will give us very good tools to work with. Now, how can the public sector, the Swedish public sector, use these startups? Because these are entrepreneurs, come up with good ideas, and how can we bring them to the public sector? The interesting part is none of these three examples I told you about is currently used by the Swedish public sector. If you go to the official site on asthma, it basically tells you don't get these jobs, don't go to these places, but there's no mentioning of this service, even though the public savings would be enormous if that were introduced in Sweden. So how can we connect to these brains outside the public sector? And this is what we've been trying to get a hold of. How can we orchestrate a data-driven ecosystem that drives social innovation? And that's not an easy task, because what you see, even among big companies, 7 out of 10 companies don't answer to public calls of procurement because the administrative procedures are so heavy. I'd say 10 out of 10 digital startups won't even bother answering public procurement calls because, hey, working with the public sector, I might see profit 3 years down the line. I go bankrupt in 3 months. If you ask venture capitalists, would they invest in a social innovation? They will go, no, because the payback time is so very long, far away. So we need to build our own ecosystem to be able to draw on that innovative power that we see in the digital startup scene. An interesting thing with Sweden is that no one thought that Sweden would actually become a leading startup nation, but it turns out an unintended consequence of the welfare system is that people are very willing to take risks because there's a safety net. So Sweden is now second to Silicon Valley when it comes to digital startups and unicorns. So this is tremendous resource that we want to use, but it's really hard to tap this resource. So I'll just give you a few examples of what we do in Sweden to try to reap the benefits of this data-driven innovation that takes care in the new data environment outside the public sector. How can we make that part of reinventing Sweden 2.0? How can that make Sweden smart? As many of you are aware of, and like Denmark really gave a good example, is we also need to work with supply of data, both inside the public sector, where we now appointed a national archive to be the competence hub of creating both regulation, standards, and competence for increasing the supply of public data. But we're also looking into approaching private companies to have them release their data. I heard that the airline companies, they actually measure air quality 500 times a second to optimize their engines. So we have a couple of thousand air quality labs flying up here. How about sharing that data down to us? What can we do with that? So we're trying to look into ways of building data alliances, put it that way. Now, the other part of having a mixed data environment is aggregation of data becomes really important. Now we have the national portal called opendata.se, which is now DCAT enabled, which means that it harvests, and it could harvest both private and public data, so you get the links to the data sources, basically. So I'd say that's sort of top-notch. We're also building underneath that a data hotel. That means that everyone that doesn't want you to access your computer or your API, you can batch your data into that hotel, and then together with, which is called the NODS, the National Open Data Service, you can store that data set in there, and it automatically creates an API to that. And then you can sort of disaggregate access to your computer, but still have full availability of publishing your data in a standardized manner. Now, what we've seen is that just increasing supply won't get you the value you want, because value happens in the innovation. And this is what I've been trying to phrase here, that on the developer side, we're then promoting social entrepreneurship and trying to connect to both investors, but also setting up these kinds of open labs. We have an eGov lab, we have an Xperia lab for health, and we have a traffic lab. Traffic lab was the first image you saw, where you basically connect developers with data sets with users. And out of that, you can bring innovation. But what we see when we look around the world, there's a lot of labs, a lot of hackathons, a lot of competitions. Everybody's struggling with what we call the post-hackathon problem. Yes, you can throw a hackathon. You get a good idea, and that idea dies quite quickly if you don't create a company out of it, if you don't find venture capital that is willing to invest in that. And that won't happen if the public sector don't say, we will be your first customer. So how can we create alliances within the municipalities, within the agencies, say, I like your idea, we will work with you, we will turn this into a success story. So in order to drive that, we pointed to 4 pilot agencies that get a government assignment to digitize certain value chains. The first is smart cities, the second is the food chain, the third is smart environment, and the fourth is smart entrepreneurship. So these agencies should then work with data maturity, work with open data, and then actively work with open innovation to try to find digital startups, companies wanting to work with this social challenge that the agency owns. And then they will have access to the lab structure and the accelerators. To the side of that, we're working with a platform where we work closely with industry, both the digital startups, but also the established IT industry, to create an alliance or an ecosystem of the willing, of the actors that wants to work with Sweden 2.0. And just on a finishing note, this is how we think we can make Sweden smarter. Nothing says an ecosystem needs to be national. The Nordic countries, they have, I think, 2% of global GDP, but 10% of the unicorns. So there's some really potential in looking into the possibility of forming a Nordic or Nordic-Baltic ecosystem that drives digital social innovation. So I'll end on that note and just say thank you.
All right. Well, lots of things on the table. Yes. So, does anybody want to ask something about Sweden? All right, one question.
Hello, Magnus. Olpe Christian from Minister of Finance, Finland.
Hi.
How you see the public funding in this picture? Can the public sector be the venture capitalist in your case?
Actually, we have something called an industry fund, which is sort of old money that was invested in this fund, and they usually do industry investments where you see market failure, and we've also spoken to. We have a kind of organizational structure of incubators, and that also work with accelerators. And all of them are extremely interested in participating in this. Now, the trick will be the legislation for procurement, because you have to do this in a pre-commercial fashion. You have to work inside the where you do research and development in a pre-commercial phase. So this is why we said that on the collaborative stage, that needs to be very early on in the process. And everything that is publicly financed must be published openly and freely, free for reuse. And there is a fine line when it comes to supporting private interests in this. I think we found a model. It's taken about a year of hard work of finding an organizational model that enables a public-private partnership around this very early type of ideational process, where you go from ideation to startup, basically. Then you have to hand off when you go from startup to scale up. And that's sort of another piece of that, but you have to build alliances of especially investors that are willing to take that step. At the same time, lowering thresholds inside the public sector to have people wanting to invest.
Thank you. Good luck.